Well, we move into labeling theory now. Labeling theory, another symbolic interactionist approach to crime and deviance, emerged from the works of Howard Becker, uh, who is now 91 years old. He's still with us. Howard Becker wrote a book back in 1963 called The Outsiders, which became the basis of labeling theory. Another figure in labeling theory is William Chambliss, who lived from 1933 to 2014. You should be familiar with William Chambliss because he wrote that article called The Saints and the Roughnecks. So he's a figure not just in symbolic interactionism and labeling theory, but also in criminology. Labeling theory is sometimes also known as reaction theory, and one of the reasons why it's called reaction theory is because what's important to labeling theorists is not behavior itself. It's not what I do or not what you do, but it's how people react to what I do or how people react to what you do that makes something deviant. So deviance actually rests not in the behavior itself, but in the way that people react to it. So it's called reaction theory. It focuses on the significance of labels that are attached to people, the significance of labels that are conferred on people and their behavior. So these labels can become part of our self-concept and move us toward the development of a deviant or a delinquent or a criminal identity, just as they can move us toward the development of a normal identity. So the labels that people are given, the labels that are conferred upon people affect their own and others' perceptions of them. The way I am labeled affects my own identity. One of the things that labeling theorists talk about is the difference between what they call primary and secondary deviance. And the difference between primary and secondary deviance runs something like this. Primary deviance is where a behavior gets labeled, right? So I act a certain way and people define that behavior, they label that behavior. Secondary deviance would be where I now internalize this behavior. It becomes part of my identity. I get labeled as a criminal, let's say, or I get labeled as a delinquent, and I incorporate that label into my own identity. I start to see myself that way. So there's a kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy aspect here to labeling theory. If I get labeled as a delinquent and I internalize that delinquent identity, then I become the thing that you have labeled me as. Self-fulfilling prophecy. It's all based on the idea of the relativity of deviance, which we talked about before. There's no behavior or no act that is in itself deviant. And that goes back to an idea that we talked about originally with Goffman and stigma. There's no behavior or no act in itself that is stigmatizing. No behavior or no act in itself that is deviant. Rather, it's relative to who's doing the defining. It's relative to the context. So therefore, deviance is relative to the reactions of others to the behavior. The next thing we need to talk about then is how people respond to the process or to the act of being labeled. How would you or how does anybody respond to the labeling process? In a way, that's what Irving Goffman's stigma was all about. People in danger of being stigmatized, people in danger of being labeled negatively, and trying to manage their identity in such a way as to deflect that label from them. So that's what we're talking about, right? How people respond to the labeling process. So how people respond to the labeling process often influences whether or not they will develop a deviant identity. So I have a picture here of some outlaw bikers, and one of the I'll explain what these are as we go along here too. These are some friendly folks who represent the Mongols Motorcycle Club. You see this patch on one of the jackets that says one percenter. We'll talk about that. So Henslin and others say that one way that people process deviant labels is to actually embrace them and to revel in a deviant identity. And you have a really good example of that would be outlaw bikers. They don't resist being labeled as a criminal, right? They don't resist being labeled as criminals. In fact, they revel in it. It becomes a badge of honor for them. So embracing the deviant label represents this rejection of mainstream norms and conformity to some other subcultural norm. Rejection of the mainstream norm, conformity to the subcultural norm. So being labeled in this way becomes a matter of pride. This patch that says 1%er is an expression of pride in being labeled as actually as a criminal. So I have here, what does this 1%er label mean? Well, the expression 1%er was coined by the American Motorcycle Association in response to the 1947 Hollister riot that took place in Hollister, California. And in their response, the American Motorcycle Association said that 99% of motorcycle riders are law-abiding citizens. So what this patch means is that we are the 1% who are not law-abiding citizens. So, and we're proud of it. Now, we maybe also want to remember Robert Granfield's article, Making It by Faking It, right? Because in that article, some of those working class law students that he talks about, some of them try to deflect that possibility of being stigmatized by faking it, by trying to fit in, by trying to pass, right, as middle class. But others actually embrace their working class identity. And he talks about different ways that they actually embrace and flaunt their working class identity back out. So one possible response or one possible reaction to being labeled in a certain way is to actually embrace the label. But there's also people also sometimes try to resist or to reject deviant labels, and that's where we get into this. We start to talk about Gresham Sykes and David Matza. And in your book, there's a discussion of the work of Sykes and Matza and their techniques of neutralization. Now, what techniques of neutralization are ways that people try to redefine behavior to try to make it appear normal. So it's through these techniques of neutralization that people attempt to reject labels or to neutralize them, to counteract them. I have a picture here of an old movie poster from the 1950s called Reform School Girl. And the reason I have it up there is because Sykes and Matza did their work on these techniques of neutralization. Or they came to these techniques of neutralization through their work, which was on juvenile delinquents. Back then, people were really making a big deal about juvenile delinquency. It was being seen as the new big social problem, and so scholars were interested in juvenile delinquency. Sociologists were interested in juvenile delinquency, and certainly there were all kind of movies coming out of Hollywood that were also about juvenile delinquency. Rebel Without a Cause is maybe one of the more famous ones. Blackboard Jungle and others. So juvenile delinquency was the big topic of conversation both in academia and in popular culture around the time that Sykes and Matza were studying these juvenile delinquents and interviewing them. And through their interviews of juvenile delinquents, they came across, or they discovered, they categorized different ways that people, right, try to neutralize these deviant labels, right? So I wanted to put them up here, and we'll talk about them a little bit. All right. So we have 5 major ways that people deflect the deviant label, try to redefine it as something else, try to normalize deviant behavior. So the first one is denial of responsibility, where a person tries to redefine behavior as something they really had no control over. If you, I say down here at the bottom, pay attention to how these techniques of neutralization were used to justify cheating in the article Situational Ethics and in the article Becoming a Hitman. In Situational Ethics, which is about college student cheating, students sometimes when they were confronted with cheating tried to say it was something they really couldn't avoid. That the demands of the professor were so unreasonable that they were forced, to have to cheat, and so it really wasn't their fault. Even defining themselves as a kind of a victim. The next one is denial of injury. So denial of injury is a kind of rationalization of behavior that is claiming that it wasn't really wrong because nobody got hurt. Yeah, I cheated, but nobody died. So what's the big deal? So denial of injury, no harm was done. So why? What's the harm, right? What's the big deal? The next one is denial of victim. So some of the boys in Sykes and Matza's study thought about what they did in terms of the person who was the target of their action, right? Was deserving of whatever they had coming to them. So there really wasn't a victim. There wasn't any innocent victim. The person had it coming to them. In Becoming a Hitman, that article is about how this professional hitman rationalizes or neutralizes his behavior. And one of the things that he sort of says in that article is, well, if they hired me to, kill this person, they must have done something really bad. They must have done something really, really wrong. So they got what they deserved. The next one is condemnation of the condemners. So condemnation of the condemners is a claim that no one has a right to stand in judgment, right? No one has a right, for example, to stand in judgment of me. The boys in Sykes and Matza's research said things like, who are you or who are they to accuse me? Those that condemn me are just as bad, right, if not worse. And in fact, in the article on situational ethics and college student cheating, we get that one a lot, right? Like, why are you signaling me out? Everybody does it. So why are you signaling me out? So condemnation of the condemners. And then finally, the appeal to higher loyalties. Appeal to higher loyalties is a neutralization technique where antisocial behavior, like when Sykes and Matza interview these kids, these boys, a lot of them talk about how they had, uh, a higher loyalty, for example, to their friends, or that they had a higher loyalty to their gang. And that loyalty to their gang, for example, outweighed any other loyalty and even outweighed the norms of society. I mentioned MS-13 before, and this is one of the ways that, one of the things that was discussed in this documentary was a murder. It really was about an MS-13 murder. And they were talking to the people that committed the murder. And, basically what he said was, in fact, they murdered a friend of theirs. And what he said was, I owed this to the gang. The gang demanded this. And that loyalty to my gang outweighs every other consideration. So, in fact, there's one of the sayings of MS-13 is, you live for your God, you live for your family, but you die for your gang, right? So the appeal to higher loyalty. And even in situational ethics and college student cheating, and I'm not comparing by any means, college undergraduates to MS-13 members, but when they talk to people that engaged in cheating, especially the type of cheating where I wasn't necessarily cheating off of someone else, but I was allowing somebody to cheat off of me, which is a bad thing to do too, which is a no-no as well. And when they were caught doing that, allowing somebody to cheat off of them, they said, my friend was in trouble and I felt obligated to help. So that's an example, another example of appeal to a higher loyalty. So again, in the end, look at those articles, look at situational ethics and college student cheating, and look at on becoming a hitman, and see how techniques of neutralization, either these five or I don't think that list of five is necessarily exhaustive, but pay attention to how people try to redefine their behavior as something more normal. Okay, so now we are going to move on to part 6. And in part 6, we're going to start talking about the functionalist model. We're going to get off of symbolic interactionism here, and we're going to start to talk about the functionalist model of crime and deviance.